Hello everyone, welcome back. It's Kevin with VintiqueSound.com, and today I wanted to do an update video on all the acoustical treatment that I've been working on, as well as speaker positioning and listening position, as well as the progress on some of the Helmholtz Resonators that I've been experimenting with. So let's go ahead and switch screens. So I have a whole crap ton of room EQ measurements that we can walk through. There's several kind of inflection points that I really want to point out. So first things first, what I wanted to show is the Room EQ Wizard has a room simulator, and you can adjust the room size as well as the speaker position and listening position, and you can import that predicted room response as an actual sort of measurement that you can cross-reference between your actual measurements. So if we have a look here, the peaks and the nulls are basically well predicted. They're just kind of slightly shifted. But overall, this is a pretty good estimate of what my room actually ends up sounding like, or the frequency response. But I guess for starters, so what I did is I believe it's Insider Acoustics, a German guy on YouTube. Excellent videos. He has a bass hunter technique, I believe it is, where you put the speaker in the corner and you play music and potentially like sweeps of low frequencies especially, and you pick a lengthways axis or a widthway axis of your room, and you use that as the starting point or the starting point axis, and you move your chair, physically just kind of roll it forward and backwards and try and find a sweet spot where the low frequencies are well balanced. So this is what I did, and that's how I ended up with my current listening position, which I think is like 173 centimeters from the front wall. So once I chose that listening position, then I wanted to measure the speakers from that specific point and not move it at all. And then move the speakers around, then start to introduce the acoustic treatment. So here you can see me set up the speakers in the corners. It was easier to fit them closer into the corners by putting them on the sides like this, as opposed to the traditional, like stood up as opposed to on their sides, which is, I think, their primary use. So you can see both sides. And this is the larger view. So one major thing to be aware of is the speaker boundary interference response. And if you look up online, you can get a good idea of what that is. So I'm no expert in this, but to my understanding, the closer that the subwoofer can be to the wall, the less pronounced the interference response will be. And the optimal solution is actually to have the complete front face of the speaker to be inset, built into the wall, so that it's basically flush. So that creates, I think it's called a infinite baffle surface, where the entire wall is acting as just I guess it's called a baffle, where there is no interference response because there's no discrepancy in time from the low frequency source and its reflection, which in turn is out of phase with the source and causes an interference response and causes nulls. So we'll talk more about that with my measurements, because it's quite clear that there's an effect. Putting them in the corners like this, I think, gets them closer to the side walls and the back walls, and thus helps to reduce some of those SBIRs. So there were 3 speaker positions that I chose. This second one is basically the same distance that I had my old speaker set up, that were not on speaker stands, but on the kind of speaker stands built into the desk. And it's all of these are equilateral triangle as well. So equal distance between each speaker and the listening position to each speaker. And that position corresponds to this here. So it is 53 centimeters from the front wall and 94 centimeters from the side wall. And then there's a third position that was sort of closer in, 87 from the front wall and 101 from the side wall. You could see here it's just slightly more inset from each wall. So these are all at 1/24th smoothing. And you can see as you pull the speakers away from the corners, so here's the corner, as you pull it away closer in, it starts to balance out some of these low mid frequencies. These peaks are not quite as pronounced, and it seems to sort of balance that out, which is good. But the other thing is that it creates even more sort of interference or cancellation or reduction in the energy between this low frequency low frequency peak and this prominent 40-ish hertz peak. So there's a greater difference in the sub frequencies. There's less of a null in this section, which is quite nice of a difference. But I think the imbalance here is perhaps not ideal. So another thing by having the speakers closer to a boundary is it will emphasize the very low frequency peaks. So as you can see, when I pull the speakers even further in, this is, I think, the RT 38% rule, which it's quite nice how it reduces that 40 hertz peak. It sort of balances that out to the other frequencies much better. But you can see the energy here is just sucked right out around 65 hertz. And this other peak at about 77, 78 is greatly reduced as well. So there's basically this giant hole here between 50 hertz and 100 hertz. So that really starts to suck the energy out of that area. And the lowest null is among the worst, like it's on par. So really not ideal. The low frequency or low mid frequencies at about 115 start to fill in. So that's nice. There's probably quite a bit more punch in those low frequencies. This peak is poking out. So overall, out of these three measurements, I think the RT38 was probably the worst. And the corners were maybe the best, but with this huge peak here that was not ideal. So what I wanted to do is just test what positions from here on out would make the greatest difference as far as paneling. So I have these big wall panels that are approximately 6 inches deep of foam insulation, or not foam insulation, acoustic foam treatment. I started with the rear and then also moved it to the front, kind of just behind the speakers, so that the very first reflections off the front wall can be treated. You'll see I started the measurements against or using the RT38 position first. So this one, let's see, I'll have to consult these. So this is on the back wall, and this one here is on the front wall. So if we start looking at the rear panel first, you can see some of the energy gets reintroduced. The nulls sort of get sucked back up. These peaks are more pronounced. These nulls are more pronounced. So overall, the rear is not really doing too much. If we go to the front panel, this energy is sucked out even worse. Some of these peaks and nulls are starting to balance out a little bit. I just wanted to see, like, at first glance, because these are the biggest surface coverage, and I think it's the greatest thickness out of all my panels. And on the 38, it really wasn't doing it very much at all. So from there, I put the speakers back into the second position, which is I now had the panels on the back wall, and you can see it has, I think, a greater difference, probably more beneficial. The only downside to this addition is this peak is really starting to reduce, so there's more of a null, or more of a gap in energy. It brings back some of this energy especially. These nulls are reduced quite a lot, and energy is brought back in. Some of these peaks are heightened. That's probably a good thing because it's starting to balance out compared to this giant peak at 40 hertz. Then I added the panels to the sidewalls instead. So that's first reflections right to the sidewalls. And this, I think, was a even better starting point. So you could see this energy is actually even more lifted up. The peaks all around this area are much more balanced. So that ended up ultimately being the first final position where I was going to keep those wall panels. Next on the list was the corner traps on both left and right, as well as the upper section. So first is just the corner trap addition. You can see it's really starting to change. Again, some of those nulls and peaks to balance them out. And it is introducing a little bit more energy, maybe dispersion in some ways. Some of the low frequencies are, I think, rising a little bit. This orange one here has all three, so the two as well as the top corner one. So the difference there by adding the one straight above me is a little bit more added energy and peak reduction. Again, nothing major, but I think overall it's more balanced. Oh yes, so that also included one more in the corner back over here. So I also wanted to check if, instead of putting this corner trap at the front top and this in the back corner, if I put them instead against or on top of the side wall first reflections, you can see this is the left front corner. So I moved those two at the top of the first reflection corners. And the difference there is pretty negligible. It kind of just moves certain peaks and nulls around. Not super ideal. The next one is putting it back to its original position, the three corners and the one back up top in front of me, as well as the listening position 3-inch cloud above me. So that is the pink one here, which if you see here, so that's the cloud up on the ceiling just above the listening position, kind of in between, so that the first reflections from the ceiling are treated. This is the left side, left corner. That's the front. And you can see that these low frequencies are starting to get more balanced. So this peak is reduced. This null is reduced. A bit more of a trough in that section. But overall, I think it's more balanced. So I think that was a better choice. Next was the same sort of 3-inch squares just behind the speakers at the first reflection to the front wall. So again, like getting a little bit more balanced. These nulls are getting more treated. Some of these peaks are getting a little bit more controlled. That's good. A little bit more balanced overall, except of course this gross peak over here. Then a 1.5 inch? Yeah, 1.5 inch wall panels, so very similar to the sidewalls. These just help with the high frequency balance overall. That is number 13. If you can see, it's really not doing too much in low frequencies. Well, there's a little bit of difference, but you can see it goes down even to like 150-ish. Kind of starting to balance some of those things out, giving more energy back here in that null, evening out some of those peaks. I think for the most part, it helps with that sort of flutter echo. Next is the addition to the cloud kind of just behind me. So that is kind of just trying to take up space in a very obvious empty piece of the ceiling. It's not very thick, so again, it's not going to help significantly with low frequencies. And you can see here, there's not a lot of difference. Kind of just moving, again, some of those nulls and peaks a little bit. I wouldn't say that that's any more balanced, but it's probably helping for flutter and whatnot if you're in the back part of the room. Next is these 12-inch cubes on top, kind of hoping to get a little bit more low frequency absorption in the corners. It doesn't seem to do a heck of a lot. It's taking care of some of those peaks, I believe. You can see here 150, but I don't know if it's really that much balanced, more balanced. It's not really that much extra volume coverage, so I wouldn't expect it to make a huge difference. Next is a 1-inch mini panel on the side, or on the door of the room. So on the back, you can see right here. Oh, yeah, so these are on the bottom of the corner to make it symmetrical. There's not a real possibility to have another corner bass trap here, so I just stuck these on the floor. This is really almost nothing at all, but I figured I'd just measure the difference anyways. I think the difference is probably more to measurement error than anything. Next is, okay, yeah. So now we're actually getting into putting furniture in the room. So this is the very front view prior to putting furniture in. So I wanted to add in furniture in places that made sense, like ergonomically, or as far as being able to get the things that I need. So I wanted these shelves to be accessible, but I wanted to also test putting furniture in specific places that could help with absorption and potentially scattering of some kind. You could see some of the low frequencies getting affected and some of the high frequencies. Again, it's pretty negligible. Could be half due to the furniture and half due to errors in measurement. I also tried moving these off to the side. It's just as accessible, but creates more symmetry, I think, in the front back wall surfaces. It seems to be roughly the same. I also wanted to move it to the side to see if this addition of the futon in a nice symmetrical place, which has quite a bit of foam built into it, hopefully that would be a symmetrical absorption in the back to help with low frequencies. And futon on the back wall. That did not make a huge improvement. In fact, it kind of sucked some energy out of this peak, brought more of a null in that area. It may have sort of balanced out some of these peaks. Like you can see that peak, this peak, and that peak are more closely aligned. So it's probably more affecting this area. But again, these are not big changes, and some of that might be due to measurement error. The next one is the small Yorkville rack desk. I don't know if you can see, this is a better view. So this is the current desk that I'm using. It's built as just a side desk rack, but it's big enough for me to actually use as a desk. And I like the small footprint that it has because it'll have a lot less desk reflections that really affect that mid-range frequency area. So this addition, we can see some of this energy I think is getting more balanced, oddly enough. Although there's this nasty peak here. That's about 500 hertz roughly. That's probably actually from the desk reflection and causing the sort of comb filtering. And that's very typical. It's somewhere in the mid frequencies, like 400 to maybe 1500 K or so. There's usually some kind of reflections off of desks that cause interference from the source and the reflected surface area, which causes phase interference, and typically that transcribes into some sort of comb filtering. So oddly enough, we get some energy back in this area, but then a nasty null there. Next was adding, well, there's another view. Next was adding the non-furniture, but just preliminary additional sort of things. Like I have a full drum kit with drum kit case. This is basically a nice pillar with quite a bit of density in it, but I wasn't really looking to absorb or make any improvements necessarily. But I wanted to see if putting it anywhere would cause any issues. Here it's actually taking care of this one null. Seems to be balancing out some of these peaks, but causing more disturbances in the low frequencies here. Overall, I don't think it's a win, but I just kept it there because it's a good location. It's out of the way. And I think it's helping with some of the mid frequencies, so why not keep it there? And then all the extra junk. So let's see what that is. There's a light that's here. You can see like a couple extra rack gear. I think I was selling this at the time. There's a little keyboard. There's these tiny little speakers that I put on the side. There's a keyboard. There's a Laney amp. There's a little bit of extra foam and little bits that are kind of lying around. And I think that is all the extra junk. So that is 22. So you can see it's really not making a huge difference at all. Perhaps it's slightly more balanced in some of these frequencies. Next is the Mixcubes. So I really like having this extra set of speakers. Creating a full balanced mix on these KH310s is amazing, but it's really, really nice to have a secondary speaker like these that are very mid-focused, and a lot of that like low energy is kind of just completely rolled off by, for sure, 50 hertz, but I think it starts to roll off at about 80 or so. And when you switch between the two, it's a very nice contrast, and you can really hear the fundamental energy just get sucked away, and you hear that very clear, focused energy in the mids, and the tops are even rolled off. And you switch back and forth. You go back to the Neumanns, and it pops. It refreshes your ears and your perspective while mixing. And I don't have a second set of speaker stands to put them on, and I wanted to make sure that putting them on top of these speakers was not going to negatively affect the frequency response. So that is number 23. So if you can see, it's not making a big difference in the negative. It may be slightly balancing things out in certain aspects, but also creating more nulls. So I think there's going to be some vibrations. But overall, this is perfect. It has very limited change in frequency response. So I was glad to see that those are not causing any major noticeable issues. So next is the added desktop stuff. So that would be the computer monitor. So at the time, I only had this thing, or I only had room for a single monitor that did not have the attachment arms that I have now. So it was this single monitor. You could see the frequency response overall is more, it kind of more or less keeps its balance, but it's causing some issues in these mid-frequency nulls. So that's unfortunate. It's I do need a monitor, so there is no way for me to get around that. Eventually, like I said, I ended up buying these studio monitor sort of mounting arms that attach to the desk that I have, and I'm able to stack two different monitors on top of each other. And I think I was actually able to get it just slightly further back if I want. And stacking them one on top of another, I think helps to prevent from having them too wide and causing more issues from the speakers on the side. So that I love having two stacked on top of each other. It's actually quite nice. So with all of that, with where the speakers were, and with all the treatment that I had available, and all my furniture and everything put into place, there was really nothing else to do but to actually start to tweak the speaker settings. So if you could see here, I started tweaking with the speaker settings. I reduced the mids by 1.5 decibels, and I like that change. It's slightly more balanced in those mid frequencies with the rest. It really is not affecting those nulls so much, but it's bringing down these frequencies, which is nice. The bass I reduced by 2.5 decibels. It brought all these peaks down nicely. It is causing more of a dip in these frequencies, so that is really a plus and a minus, a pros and a cons. So I didn't want to suck too much more energy out of these frequencies and kept that nasty peak here at 40 or 38 hertz. So if we compare this final measurement with what we started with the empty room, with the speakers in that secondary position, we could see a lot of these peaks are being tamed. The null has been reduced. There's more energy back into that area. The low mid peaks are nicely handled. A lot of these major nulls are brought back in. The unfortunate thing, I think, with the desk and the monitors is these three peaks these three nulls are pretty substantial. The fact that they're quite a bit higher up in frequency than these nulls is good because those are more manageable. And overall sort of balance in these frequencies from like 1K up is more linearly balanced, I guess. I don't know. So if we change this from 1/24th smoothing to 1/3 smoothing, we go from no treatment from this null to these peaks, roughly 14.5 decibel jump down to 11. So moderate improvement. Here we have 20 decibels down to 17. So it's not a huge difference, but overall it was quite a bit more balanced. I could really sense the difference, but I was not satisfied because this low frequency dip and this bump is just too great of a difference. And I could really hear that there was a lack of punch in all those reference tracks that I had. So what was nice about testing this speaker setup is that was basically the setup that I was used to in this room, and basically like the last two studio rooms that I had. And it was more or less the treatment that I had to begin with. and I wanted to see what I can do to maximally control peaks and troughs. So another thing that I wanted to test is I built these panels quite a long time ago. What I used was this corrugated plastic. It's really quite lightweight, but it's just a nice surface area that you can glue things onto, which I glued the foam to that surface, and then I used wood framing to just frame around and have things to create hooks and create the strength. But I wanted to figure out if having a solid backing was preventing airflow from flowing through and causing issues with the absorption. So I ended up doing a test with the 3 corner traps first. I removed a big chunk of that plastic backing where it was not helping with the glue or the structure. And you can see the difference. There's really not too big of a difference. I'm getting some frequency energy or low frequency energy back, but it's pretty negligible. These sort of mid frequencies are changing. It's kind of a benefit in some ways, maybe a detriment in other ways. So overall, that was not creating much of an issue. That's only the corners. And I do have further testing on the other bigger panels, which has more surface area removed. Spoiler alert is that they didn't make too much of a difference. In fact, removing it may have ultimately made a slightly worse outcome. So at some point, I just stopped comparing tests and I didn't gut or take away plastic in all of my panels. It wasn't worth the effort, as well as the destruction to the solid backing. So another thing that I wanted to experiment with is Helmholtz resonators. So at this point, there was basically a crossroads of 2 potential options. The first thing is, again, changing speaker position, which I knew putting them into the corners was going to be my next major test. The second is trying out Helmholtz resonators. And the build process is not particularly easy. But what I wanted to do was first test the Helmholtz resonator, because I felt that if I can get some of these peaks and nulls controlled, that current speaker position was quite optimal for being able to get to like around the speakers in my like logistically. All the chords wouldn't be as stretched out. Overall balance, I think, is nice from about 130-40 hertz onwards. So if I could fix these things in the low frequencies with the Helmholtz resonators, then it would be worth keeping the speakers where they were. So if we go to the first speaker or first Helmholtz resonator, it has a upper bound frequency of 66 hertz. So this is with no cap whatsoever. And the bigger size of hole at the front, the higher in frequency it goes. If you put a front sort of panel on the front with a hole cut out, the smaller the hole, the lower the frequency. And then if you put tubing and extend the tube, the longer the tube, the lower the frequencies go. So the idea was that these smaller ones, which I think are 8-inch diameter, I wanted those to affect higher frequencies. And the highest I can get this one to go is 66 hertz, which is unfortunate because I have this spreadsheet with measurements and predicted frequencies. 71 to 76, I'd say, is roughly those problem frequencies that are peaks in I think it's front and back and the sidewalls. If not, perhaps it could be a ceiling. Oh, I think I have it. Yeah, okay. So the 71 is the first ceiling mode or node. The 76-ish is the second axial mode for the length of the room. And I believe that those are the ones that are out of phase and causing more issues and causing cancellation around this 80 to 90 or 80 to 100 hertz. So I really wanted the Helmholtz Resonator to get up to those frequencies, and unfortunately these small ones just don't reach that. So basically I just ran with what I had. I kept that. I took the Helmholtz Resonator and I pointed it directly at the speaker, and I ran a sine wave and swept along. I think it's from like 20 up to 100 or 200 hertz roughly, just to see where it was really resonating. And that's where I measured it to be 66 as the peak. Once I had that sort of tuned or figured out, then I played that 66 hertz frequency from the speaker, and I walked around the room and I tried at all the corners, all along the side, the corners at the front. I tried the top of the ceiling, and it turns out that closer to the middle of the room ish, close to the listening position, actually was where it was vibrating the most. It wasn't vibrating all that much, but it felt like it could make a difference. So I stuck it up there, and lo and behold, it did not really make that much of a difference. And if we go to 66 hertz, that's roughly, it's kind of where there's a peak going on there. And it's actually seems to be sucking energy out. If we look at the spectrogram, which one of the benefits is that it potentially would be helping reduce the total decay time. If we have a look at that same frequency range, this is more or less noise, but it's not really helping in the frequency response nor the time decay aspect. So that's unfortunate. There is potential for, if I just target a more prominent frequency like the 70 and 76 hertz range, or if I can get Helmholtz Resonator as low as the 38 to 40 range, maybe that will start to really start to make a difference. But yeah, that's that. There is another measurement with one with a cap, so you can see the frequency is reduced, but the range at which it can vary is very unfortunately very limited. So again, I threw up the measurement here, so now 63 hertz. It's like a slight change that might be just errors due to measurement. There's a secondary Helmholtz Resonator that with no cap, it's basically the same frequency range. Really not a difference. There's also a cap for the second small Helmholtz Resonator that, again, only goes as far down to like 60 hertz up to 66 hertz, and they don't really seem to be doing much. So that was like the initial test of the Helmholtz Resonators. And to be honest, I was quite disappointed at how hard it is to build it and get the calculations all correct and everything. If I show you this online calculator, there is measurements that you can put into this calculator. There's also this thing called the end correction, and you have to get that correct, and that's also very difficult. Eric Valentine had a really, really good video out, and he showed that he was using 1.8 end correction. When I did my calculations initially, it seemed as though the end correction was more correct at 0.85. I believe I had to double that end correction at some point, because once I essentially doubled it, it was much more correct. There was like, once I changed the size of the hole for the front face, it started veering away. These frequencies were just not calculating correctly. They were going way out of range to what they were actually vibrating with the speakers. And ultimately, I think 1.68 was the correct one for me, at least in this case. But regardless, I think what the next thing that I'm going to try is these larger, I think they're 12-inch diameters. And these ones might have a greater range as to what I can play with. And I'm also going to try and target the 38, 40-ish hertz frequency as well. So I might start tuning the small ones to that frequency as well as these large ones to that frequency, or see if I can get up closer to that 76 hertz range. But for now, the Helmholtz stuff is kind of on pause. But aside from the Helmholtz resonators, I knew that I could get a better low frequency balance with putting the speakers back into the corners. And if we move to the next one, we could see here, I moved them from that current position to closer in slightly by 3 different positions. So you could see that as I was incrementally moving the speakers closer to the corners and maintaining an equilateral triangle, you could see that these low frequencies around 72-ish hertz are lifting up. This peak, for some reason, is going down. Once I moved it even closer, this null is getting deeper. That's probably the SBIR. This peak is getting much more pronounced, but also the very low frequencies are getting more pronounced because putting it closer to the surface is going to emphasize those low frequencies. Even these low mids, 150-ish, 40 hertz, is getting lifted. And then lastly, 173 is the null is getting much better, and these peaks are rising incrementally higher too. And then look at this. This whole huge lift at about 110 hertz. So that ultimately was the position that I stuck with. That's where the speakers currently are now. And you can see just such a drastic improvement in these low frequencies and these low frequencies, and the null is reduced. So I think this is probably the SBIR stuff being greatly reduced. So if we have a look at those with 1/3 smoothing, look at the lower bound nulls of this. Much more improved. So unfortunately, this is still like a low frequency hype, and it's a smiley curve without the top frequency curve action. But ultimately, this is a much better speaker position from which to work with. So my next test was to use the EQ on the speakers and try to rebalance those low frequencies that were quite heavily hyped with all the other frequencies that were quite controlled. So I reduced the bass down to -5. That may have been my starting point, but I also ultimately ended up down to -7.5. And you can see the difference from -5 down to -7.5. That's 2.5 decibels. So if we actually go to the measurement, 82.85, 86.64. So that's more than 2.5 decibels. And it's probably because it's adding 2.5 decibels, or sorry, reducing 2.5 decibels coming out of the speakers. But then that's less energy being reflected off of two of the walls. So it's probably a greater effect. And ultimately, it is much more balanced. The peak that's here is much closer to the peak that's here at 38 hertz. So much closer. The null that's here is unfortunately still there, but it's not being reduced as much as the peak is being reduced. So that's great. The null here, unfortunately, is getting sucked out quite a bit. But overall, that's a much more balanced position to start with. Now, I did do a couple more measurements with no Helmholtz Resonator and another Helmholtz Resonator in a different position. Again, just nothing really to report about there. My next plan of action was to see if removing any more of that plastic backing would help. And I really wanted to test it on the big wall panels. So I removed something like 8 or 12 good-sized square chunks from the back. So a lot of surface area removed. And you can see there's differences, some better, like this null is improved, that peak is improved, but then this null is worse. This null is improved, that one's worse. This one is worse. So it's really kind of just, you win some, you lose some. It's more or less the same. So there is one more set of panels that I wanted to test that on, and that's the square ones of 3-inch depth at the very front. They're very close to the speakers as well. So to me, that made sense to test those. And again, it's just some of the peaks are improved, some of the nulls are improved, but equally there are some that are not improved. They're made worse. So that was when I just quit worrying about the backing of those panels. Next is air gaps. So air gaps are important for extending the low frequency absorption of your panels. You don't want to go too far, but there's really good videos online. Insider Acoustic has a lot of good tips for this. There's some websites that you can go on to that sort of test what an air gap would do. So if we go with the same absorber, but with some added air gap, so the same flow resistivity, the same absorber thickness, you can see it extends the low frequency absorption, but at the cost of causing some, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but if we really show an extreme version, you see there's like comb filtering. That's maybe not ideal. You do gain a lot of benefit, but it's perhaps not exactly what you want. But even with something like 50 mils, that's, I don't know, 2 inches or something of air gap, you get some low frequency extension. And I do have already some air gaps for the sidewalls, and a lot, like especially my clouds at the roof. But the front ones, they had only about, let's say, 1 to 2 inches maybe. And I had some extra wood that I could just add on to where they hook onto the wall and just extend that air gap. And if we have a look here, you could see this null is improved. That peak is reduced. That's probably not ideal. These two peaks are improved. So that's higher up in the frequency range, from like 200 to 600 or so hertz. That's where the greatest difference is. But unfortunately, there's also some nulls that have been exaggerated. This peak has been greatly reduced. So it's, again, just win some, lose some. it's not a major change that I would worry too much about. I think there's bigger improvements that you can do by just having the right type of panel and, get those fundamental things done correctly. And that will have a greater impact than worrying about small air gaps and stuff. So then next on the list, I wanted to test whether having a single cloud was going to be similar or worse off than having two clouds. So if we go to this here, this is my benchmark, I guess you can call, with no cloud whatsoever. This is a benchmark with the added air gap with a single cloud. So if I remove the single cloud that I had prior to this measurement, you could see that no cloud, it has greater peaks and dips, I guess, maybe greater variations. Like here, there's a null, that's a peak. This is another null, that's a greater null. There's more energy here. Here's a greater peak. But ultimately, the single cloud does kind of balance out things a little bit better, I would say. Now, if we jump to having two clouds, so let's compare one cloud to two clouds. And the benefit with these two clouds is that the first reflections are better taken care of. So with the single cloud, I think there was quite a bit of a surface area where the speakers were getting to the roof and back to my ears or to the listening position. So you can see there's actually quite a big change. This null is greatly improved. This null is improved. These peaks here, there, here are reduced, maybe not improved necessarily, but overall it's a more balanced sound. So I really do like this change. That's gonna stay. There is a detrimental 800 hertz roughly, but it's not significantly worse than before. That's maybe 69 to 67. It's maybe like 2 decibel dip. But overall, I do think it's more balanced. So if we have a look, here is with the two clouds. This is basically this is the current position. And on the left, you can see this is the Helmholtz Resonator. So it doesn't look great either. I'll probably put fabric over it if I do end up sticking with it. This will have to be glued to have a more professional seal. And I might paint the wood. I'm not sure. I'll mess around with something. But this is the position where it was resonating the most. And it wasn't resonating very much. I could just start to feel it resonate in my hands. So one last thing that I want to do is just open up some of the major turning points. So if we go with the corners left and right prior to any treatment whatsoever, let's go with the equilateral triangle. So that was the initial position. This measurement here was basically the best estimate of what I was working with prior to doing this entire journey, I guess you'd call it. Let's open all of those up. Let's also open up the very last with the two clouds. Let's get these first at 1/24th smoothing, then I'll try at 1/3 octave smoothing. Let's get differences. Okay, so this is what I started with. So overall, there's quite a nice balance from 130 hertz, maybe even as low as 100 hertz, upwards. There were some mid-frequency issues. The low frequency peak was right in line with the rest of those averages. But this whole, like, what is this, 50 hertz to 100 hertz, like that was just energy sucked out, not good. I knew there was issues there. And that's the motivation that I had for going on this journey. Now, if we look at the initial position with no treatment with the speakers in the corner, you can see that energy is brought right back in, but at the detriment of some major peaks. There's some major dips going on, 250, a lot of variation, not super controlled. We compared that with the same speaker position, but with no treatment, essentially. I think this actually did have some EQing to tame the low end. Yeah, you could see there's a lot of variability in the low mids and the low frequencies, just really not contained. And then lastly is the current position with the two clouds. So there's much more energy here being brought in. So what is this? 40-ish hertz to about 80-ish hertz, and then up again to about 120 hertz. So that's basically at each octave, there's much more balance of energy. And these mid frequencies are still well controlled. There's less mid frequency dips. And this whole section is just greatly improved. So overall, if I can just sum it up, I went from this first initial starting point, not having a very thorough and methodical way of finding a sweet spot for speakers and listening position and positioning for my panels and stuff. And I took what I had at my disposal. I didn't add anything other than the Helmholtz Resonators, which really didn't do much at all, as you could see. But by methodically adding panel by panel, moving speakers back and forth at the outset, and then later on when I had a hunch that moving them back to the corners would make a greater improvement, that has really, really brought a much more balanced sound. And I can really hear the difference. The other thing is that once I moved the speakers back to the corners, somewhere along towards the end, it sounded like I was listening to headphones. That's how good the stereo imaging had improved. The phantom center, I think, was improved. And everything I could just locate and hear reverb, the dispersion between left and right. So everywhere from center to far right and far left, everything in between, I could hear that a lot better. All those little details. And then with the added frequency balance, especially in this low end, I could really start to hear the low end detail in the bass and the transients, and overall everything was just much more improved. So if we go with a 1/3 smoothing to just wrap this all up, yeah, much more balanced. So what do I have now? I have a peak to trough plus or minus 4 from that lower end, and plus or minus 5.5-ish from the greatest outlier. So that is going to be it for this video. I hope that this was not too boring walking through all these details, and hopefully there's added value. I could tell you right now that I'm very, very glad that I went on this little journey and made the changes, because the difference in quality of sound it's hard to describe. There's every aspect has been improved. And I hope that this will be of help, of use to you. So thank you for watching. Take care and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.